to agenda item number 2. We have now before us the consideration of the proposed amendments to Title 53 of the Rules of the City of New York. Are there any comments from the board or staff on the draft of proposed amendments to Title 53, excuse me, Title 53 of the Rules of the City of New York? Go ahead.
Is there a, I don't know how to phrase it, is there a penalty for the organization's failure to make the required inquiries to get to the aggregate amount? It seems like we're putting a burden there where there's no obligation, there's no penalty if they don't do it.
Chris, can you speak to that?
Well, the penalty provisions are in the local law itself, and so
For the failure to,
for the failure to make the appropriate disclosures that of the organization's knowledge, and so if
you fail to take appropriate steps to get that knowledge, then obviously.
If that's incomplete, then if they knew something that's, if they knew that a household member of one of its donors is in the doing business database, then they would be subject to that penalty for violating 3902.
So you can't just stick your head in the sand, we didn't know.
Right, although I think what I heard you asking is, what if they don't make any inquiries?
Because they'll say, I didn't know. Well, you didn't know because you didn't ask, but you're saying you actually have an obligation to know.
Right, because the individuals who make up the organization's knowledge base are those individuals who are listed in the proposed section, and so we consider that to be one and the same as to what their knowledge is and to what either the elected official or the agent, the board members, and those three principal officers. And so we consider that knowledge to be one and the same in looking at what the organization knows.
Any further questions or comments?
On the retention period on records, we say 6 years. The statute seems to be a lot.
We said
You said a 6 years.
yes. We set 6 years in order to keep that in line with the board's retention periods for other aspects, such as the annual financial disclosures.
Jeff, where are you seeing the conflict? Just you want to just flag that?
Well, there 3-05 of the rules.
Right.
It's talked about going to a 6-year period of retention.
Right, and in the law?
I think that 3902C, I think, is what I was.
Oh, it says for at least 3 years.
Yes, and that's just the donor written submission.
Right.
And so this is a much broader retention, so that the board can, if it needs to, the board can audit to make sure that the organization is actually complying with the regulations. And so I think they serve different purposes there, and so wouldn't be in conflict.
The other point where we add the criteria for determining whether an agency.
Jeff, again, could you just flag the specific section or the,
Again,
just tell the rest of us?
3-03.
Yes.
Okay.
This
so
is
that's-
Right, so we add after the degree to which public servants are acting under the authority of the elected official. Do you consider, is there a Chapter 68 issue there with public servants being directed by a public official to do work for an affiliated entity?
Generally, if it is a not-for-profit that's affiliated with the city agency, that not-for-profit also accomplishes the aims of the city's purpose, and they're doing, the elected official or the agent are acting in their capacities as a public servant, and so there wouldn't be a Chapter 68
In that
in that instance. In other instances, there could be.
There could be.
If it's a personal not-for-profit that they run, it may, that's not related to their city duties, there could be a Chapter 68 violation.
So would it help to perform duties, could we say something like perform permissible duties on behalf of the organization? Because there are situations where this would be barred by Chapter 68. This is an affiliated entity that does work that's not in furtherance of the city agency. We would, I think, find this to be a violation of Chapter 68 if someone directed to do that.
Although this isn't authorizing anything, so I
No,
don't.
it doesn't, but we are adding this as a criterion. So,
We're creating all
So it's
the,
a factor that
we're
would be
creating all the
considered.
criteria.
no, it's a factor that we are adding, and we are saying, one of the things we're looking to is whether an employee is going to be directed to do this work. But in fact, being directed to do that work could, in many circumstances, be a violation of Chapter 68. And we are adding that. So I think that causes me some difficulty.
I'm sorry, sort of writhing at the adding, because
Yes.
we're adding all of this. The entire set of rules are added, so we're not,
No, I understand.
303F is not being added to 303. It's just part of the description of all of the factors that go into deciding whether or not the entity is affiliated with an elected official, and it's not licensing anything.
No,
So, I mean, maybe you could put it in the commentary, but I'm not sure I see it in the rule.
Also, I feel like the degree to which the public servant would perform duties, if that's a factor to be considered, we would be considering whether the scope of those duties and whether they're permissible or not. But so perform duties by itself seems to encompass some consideration of what those duties are.
Frankly, I think impermissible duties would actually strengthen the case. I mean, what you're basically saying is that if you're providing impermissible duties, that shouldn't be counted towards concluding whether this is an affiliated entity. I would actually think if the public servant is performing impermissible duties, that's even better evidence.
I mean, the language of F encompasses that these are duties that are as part of their official city employment. So sort of by definition, it has to be permissible under Chapter 68, the way F is described. It couldn't be anything other than
That's the way you
that.
read that clause, as part
That's-
of the
that's what
official
it-
duties.
yes.
If you read it that
But
way,
if it's
that's
not,
fine.
and we consider that as a factor, we
Yeah.
would still note that. Or,
I mean, I just don't see a problem, because I don't see that we're licensing or authorizing them to do anything impermissible. And I actually think if you said limited to perform permitted duties, that basically saying if you're performing unpermitted duties, we're not going to even look at that. Whereas I would think we would actually want to look at
You're
that
saying
more
it would be a
harshly,
factor, right.
and that would actually be a more serious factor.
Or to indicate that the elected official is actually exercising this huge amount of
Right,
control
right.
over the organization by
Right. Right, I actually think it would make it an even stronger factor. And so I think saying permitted duties actually kind of undermines it a little bit. And I don't think anyone would read this as licensing them to perform duties that are not otherwise permitted. And certainly, that it's not, the language is not the intent, so I would leave it. I don't know if there's any basis for putting comment in the comments, but I don't even think that's necessary. But if you think about it, you could think about that, I don't know. I don't see this as actually permitting anything that's not otherwise permitted. Anybody else? Questions,
I
comments?
just have more of a question rather than anything else, because looking at the two critical substantive changes that were made from the law department, and then let's basing off your memo to make it easier to follow. On page 5,
Okay.
we're talking about the first one, dealing with restricted organizations with the underwritten submissions, how we're striking that, and we're changing it to a different sort of mechanism. And that's driven, I thought, by the language that says it's any person or organization knows or should know. It's interesting, because then in the next one, when you're dealing with the unrestricted organization, the requirement is just by any person or organization knows has business dealings. So there's like a different level of mens rea, I guess, for the two regulations. So, but we're using the same mechanism.
Yes.
The mechanism being that any of the persons who have some level of authority with the organization have to do X, Y, and Z. Check.
Yes, so the organization would check to see what the individuals know, the individuals who lead the organization know. traditionally the board, and the board has read no to mean should know in its board, in the board rules. There have been the language for should know for what the individual public servant looking at an entity that has business dealings with the city. It's the board has read knowledge has imputed knowledge of the organization's business dealings with the city to what the individual should know, the individual public servant should know. And so we don't really, in reading the two different provisions that you've pointed out, we don't really see much of a difference functionally as to how that would, how that knowledge would be crystallized.
Is it purposely left out for unrestricted organizations?
We don't know. We don't know.
Should know.
Yeah.
We're gonna tag you with it.
Yeah.
No, yeah, it's just because, basically, I think what you're saying is that the level of knowledge, the board is always interpreted as including some sort of willful blindness.
Yes.
Or inquiry notice type standard anyway.
Yes.
Even
Yes.
if it's not written?
Even if it's not written, it's
Even-
explicitly.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And this is meant to crystallize that inquiry. By inquiring as to the leaders of the organization. And that creates that inquiry, and so the organization can't have that willful blindness by having having an intern or a temp type in the names and not really have any role in determining what the organization knows.
Right, so if we're looking at, I was looking at the red line, I thought that was easier
Yes.
to follow on Exhibit 4, page 16, going down to item 5, sub 3, that is the inquiry notice sort of requirements
Exactly.
for all the board members.
Yes.
So I guess the last question I had, is there anything else that we should, I thought it was pretty exhaustive, but I couldn't think of anything else. It was just prompted by the additional language, should know. Is there any sort of inquiry notice type duties that you guys thought about and decided not to include?
I mean, we thought about like what individuals to inquire of, and we in terms of like the organization staff, we honed in on the executive director, the chief finance officer, and the chief development officer, so that particularly as it relates to the development officer, that's the person who really has to foster those relationships with the donors and would have probably the most knowledge of who the donors to the organization are. And so we used those individuals as really capturing what the organization knows.
Where do we spell that out? I know we say principal officer.
That is in the definitions of 3-01. That's on Exhibit 4, page 13, and that's subparagraph H.
Okay, good. What I was looking for was the language who performs equivalent duties. So basically, it doesn't matter what you call them.
Exactly.
They're doing the job.
Exactly.
They have to do it.
Exactly. Because we sort of did a little bit of a survey, just looked to see what the organizations call these people, and they have there's some variation, but they're equivalent. The equivalencies are pretty clear.
Right, any further questions,
Not
comments?
on the rules itself, but on the 4, where we have the.
Oh, yes.
Would it help to list minor children on there as well?
We in order to make it as short as possible and as least obtrusive as possible to the individuals who are donating, the the minor children only come into play if they themselves are the donors.
Right.
And so if the fact that a large donor has minor children doesn't matter for purposes of the donation restrictions until that minor child attempts to make a donation. And so that's why we didn't want to intrude on that individual's privacy unless the minor child was making the donation. And so that's where that last set of inquiry, or the last lines on that proposed form, would only ask the names of the parents or the parents when the donor is under 18, and so then that would really be the only time when we would care who the minor child is.
It would just help in the inquiry when the agent entity itself is doing its due diligence and checking as to whether others have made contributions aggregate before the knowledge board. If they have that name before them as well, it would just make it easier in doing the inquiries.
I could
But
see.
this is not part of the rules.
This is not part of the rules, correct? It's a form that,
Form.
exactly.
So,
I could see donors be in trouble if they've got to list their 6 children under the age of 10 or something. And I think this actually captures it. I think I would be slightly put off if I was a donor if I had to list my 3-year-old.
It just makes it easier for people to do the inquiry.
I think this is actually pretty straightforward. Once you get the names of the parents' guardians, you can check that back. But if it doesn't work out, we can always, as
Yes,
you
but
say,
this is not part of the rules,
we could
so
always,
it's
exactly.
Got
So we could always
10-year-olds
rebut.
walking around giving major
Right,
donations.
right.
Well, that could be.
Big
well,
bucks.
No, that's not, at some point it happens.
Yes.
All right, any further questions, comments, thoughts? All right, then, there being no further questions, comments, or thoughts, I call for a motion that the board adopt the recommended amendments to Title 53 of the Rules of the City of New York as presented.
So,
Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
aye.
Any opposed? Not opposed? The motion for adoption of the draft as submitted has passed.
Question on the timing, I guess, so this now goes back to the law department for certification.
Let me just conclude the open meeting, we can
Okay.
continue. So there being no further business for consideration pursuant to the open meetings law, this meeting is hereby adjourned.